Let me introduce you a little bit using 2 slides on this PRIMA framework that we have been developing at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So this PRIMA framework effort has been around for about 3.5 years. And the purpose of doing that is to really develop a framework of both modeling and analysis, where we can look at the combination and the interdependencies between human system and natural systems. So I see this as a pretty different way of looking at the complete Earth system as a whole, because a lot of the analysis or modeling work that we have done or seen so far mostly focus on the natural system itself, but we do know that the human systems are also changing a lot in terms of, for example, land use, and also in terms of energy system, etc. So it is important for us to be able to combine and look at the interdependencies of the human and the natural system, so that we can understand how they might be influenced in the context of climate change or policy and socioeconomic changes. So this framework has a lot of different components that we're looking at: climate, hydrology, energy, land use, and also socioeconomics. So it is really designed to answer some specific questions, but I'm going to give you just some examples. For example, we are interested in looking at how population change and policy change combined together might affect the future electricity costs and the transmission requirements. And we are also interested in the context of changes in the future heat waves and droughts, whether that might affect energy demand, and how that might affect power plant cooling, and then the likelihood of blackouts in the future. Another example of question that we are interested in is particularly related to land use, because we know that a lot of the agricultural lands have already been converted to grow bioenergy crops. But in the context of future climate change, if droughts are going to become more persistent or more intense in the future, that could potentially cause a problem in terms of producing the bioenergy, producing both the bioenergy crop as well as the food for the future. And therefore, what might happen to the food and fuel crop prices is another question that we are interested in. And then lastly, another example is related to this is, again, if under climate change we might have more drought condition, and therefore we might have reduced water use for energy and agricultural sectors, then are we able to actually meet the emission targets that we are set out for in terms of the policy that, that might be using in the future? So these are some of the questions that we are asking. And in order to do that, we have developed this framework. This is just an overview of this. This framework broadly has 3 different components. We have over here the natural system. So here we have the so-called Earth system, where we are looking at the atmosphere, the land, and also the ocean. We have these models at 3 different scales. So we have a global scale, we have a regional scale, as well as a very local scale. So in terms of the natural system, we have the global Earth system model, which is used to drive a regional Earth system model that I'm going to mostly talk about actually in my talk. And then we are on this side, we have the integrated assessment model, where we are looking at socioeconomic changes, energy economy, water, and agricultural and land. And this integrated assessment model can be applied both globally and also regionally. And then at the so-called local scale, we have these sector models, including building energy demand, energy infrastructure, water availability, land cover and land use, as well as crop productivity. And so the previous talk literally talked about water availability, which is actually part of this sector model, which is part of this bigger picture of the PRIMA framework. So these models can be linked up together in different ways, depending on the questions that we ask. And so a very important part of this framework is really the blue box over here, where we have these stakeholder engagement activities, where we are trying to understand stakeholder decisions and support needs. So depending on that type of needs and the questions, we configure the model differently to answer specific questions. And then based on how we configure these models and analysis tools, we address uncertainty characterization of the projections that we are talking about. So this is the broad context of the regional Earth system model that I'm going to focus on mostly next in my presentation. So, okay, let me go back to this a little bit. So here, when I was talking about this framework, I emphasized a lot about some of the questions that we asked, and many of them really have to do with changes in the extreme conditions in the future, such as potentially increasing intensity and persistence of droughts. So it's really important for us to be able to understand the changes in the extreme events in the future. So in this context, I'd like to introduce a little bit of the concepts of why hydrologic extremes might be changing in the warmer world. So there have been a lot of different studies, and so far I think we have gotten a pretty good understanding of why hydrologic extremes in the warmer world may change, at least globally, perhaps not so much regionally yet. So generally, it is understood well that globally, for each degree of warming in the globe, it can cause about a 7% increase in the water vapor in the atmosphere. And this is really related to a very fundamental relationship between temperature and water vapor holding capacity for the atmosphere. But even though we might have 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere for each degree of warming, it doesn't mean that we are going to get a 7% increase in the precipitation. As a matter of fact, the increase in precipitation is actually mostly constrained by energy supply. And therefore, as a result of that, it is related to the long wave feedback coming from the water vapor. And this really constrains the increase in the precipitation to a much lower value globally at only about 2% per degree warming. In terms of extreme precipitation, we have also this kind of understanding that if you look at this particular figure, looking at this percentile for the extreme precipitation, apparently this increase in the extreme precipitation per degree warming is actually quite a bit higher than 7% or even like 2%. And so the higher the value we go in terms of the more extremes that we are looking at, some studies suggest that this is going to kind of plateau around 15% per degree warming. And this has something to do with both the thermodynamics of the system as well as the dynamics of the atmospheric system itself. So there is really a strong potential that extreme precipitation is really going to increase in the future, at least globally. But of course, regionally, there's still a lot of challenge in terms of understanding how extreme precipitation may change in the future. So besides looking at extreme precipitation, there's also a lot of projections into the future about drought events. And in fact, this study by Richard Seeger et al. In 2007 really projected this so-called mega droughts in the future for the southwestern United States, showing that there is almost kind of like a linear decrease in precipitation, which result in a change in the precipitation minus evapotranspiration that result in the amount of water you can use on land, which is the runoff amount, which is decreasing in the future. But we also know that in the western United States, a lot of the droughts are not only driven by this kind of long-term climate change, but interannual variability has a lot to do with the drought condition. For example, this year we have the drought condition in the western United States, mostly in California kind of area. And when we look at this particular analysis showing the correlation between precipitation and also the so-called El Nino index, in terms of the Pacific sea surface temperature, we see really, really strong correlation between precipitation amount in the western United States to this particular index, showing that when we look at drought events in the future, not only that we have to worry about long-term changes in the climate system, but we also have to pay attention to interannual variability and whether there might be changes in the interannual variability in the ocean that might cause changes in the drought condition as well. So with this context, I'm going to talk about some of the science questions that we are asking in terms of looking at hydrologic extremes. So we are interested in seeing how extreme precipitation and droughts might be projected to change in the United States. And we are going to use a dynamical downscaling approach using a regional model. So we are also asking the question, how may these regional projections, when we use higher resolution model, differ from global projections? And then oftentimes when we do this kind of dynamical downscaling, we have a very small number of scenarios that we can afford to do because of computational limitations. And so another question is, how can we put a small number of regional projections in the context of a larger ensemble of global projections? So how useful are these smaller number of higher resolution projections are? So these are some of the questions that we are asking. I'm not saying that we have answers to all of them, so I'm going to show you just some results where we get to so far. But eventually, the larger question that we are trying to address with the PRIMA framework is, how do changes in hydrologic extremes challenge the management of water resources and also energy production and infrastructure in the future? So this is the regional Earth system model that we are using. In a nutshell, it is consists of an atmospheric model, a land model, and then a regional ocean model, coupled together using what we call a flux coupler, which is used a lot in global Earth system model, and we adopt the same approach, which is coming from the community climate system model, or CCSM. So in addition to that, we also try to use the same land component that is used in the global model as well. So we have performed simulations for 1975 to 2005, driven by a particular global simulation, CCSM. And we have also performed simulations for 2 future climate scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5, for 2005 to 2100. We have archived hourly and daily variables, as well as performed some bias correction to the simulations as well. But for the results that I'm going to show you, those are the raw simulations coming out of our model without any bias correction. So very quickly, go through some of the results here. This is showing the observed precipitation, annual precipitation amount, comparing between CCSM global simulation versus our higher resolution regional simulation. We see that at least for the Western United States, we are capturing a lot more the spatial variability and therefore reducing the bias in terms of the annual precipitation compared to the global model. In terms of heavy precipitation, this is not surprising. In fact, when you go to higher resolution, oftentimes you would be able to better simulate the tail behavior of the precipitation distribution. So in this case, we look at the observed heavy precipitation, or the 95th percentile, coming from wintertime and the summertime, and those simulated by the global model versus those simulated by the regional model. And we can see that the wintertime, the regional model captured the spatial pattern much better, as well as the absolute amount. And even in the summertime, there's some improvement in terms of the eastern and as well as the Midwest United States in terms of heavy precipitation. In terms of the changes that we are simulating in this model, I'm just going to show you an example looking at RCP 4.5 versus 8.5. So here, when we look at the precipitation change in the wintertime, we see that the regional simulation look actually quite similar to the global simulation in terms of the climate change signals, although one has more spatial variability compared to the other. When we go from 4.5 to 8.5, we see that the patterns are still actually about the same, except that now it's kind of like enhanced. So when you go to a higher scenario, you get more larger changes in these signals. In terms of summertime, again, similar conclusion. We have very similar between global and regional simulation. And then going from 4.5 to 8.5, we see larger increases or larger reduction in this case. For temperature, similarly, we have wintertime. And then going to RCP 8.5, we get warmer compared to the 4.5 scenario, summertime, and then etc. And now, let's take a look at the long-term changes in precipitation minus evapotranspiration, essentially looking at whether there might be some drought conditions simulated by the model for the different regions. So here, we broadly look at several different regions over here. And so this is the trends that we saw in the Northwest, Midwest, Northeast, Southwest, Great Plains, and then the Southeast. What we found is that broadly in 3 different regions, particularly in the coastal areas, such as the Western United States, the Southwest, as well as in the Northeast and the Southeast, there are broad agreement in terms of the long-term changes among the simulation from the regional model, the particular global model that was used to drive the regional model, as well as the broad CMIP5 simulation, the median or the mean of the CMIP5 simulations. Except what we found interestingly is that the regional simulation actually looks more like the CMIP5 mean compared to the particular CCSM member that we look at. And very quickly now, I'm just going to go through this, looking at the different season, what is driving the changes in the precipitation minus evapotranspiration. Again, we look at the context of the regional simulation, the global simulation used to drive this regional simulation, and then we look at the broader context of the CMIP5 median and then the CMIP5 mean. Over the winter time, what we found is that there is actually a broad agreement among the various models in that P minus E would increase broadly over the Western US as well as the Eastern United States. And then for the springtime, again, broad agreement among these different models showing reduction in P minus E, so suggesting that essentially these are really robust feature associated partly with the change in the temperature causing a change in the snow melt as well as the precipitation falling as rain versus snow. And therefore, there is an increase in P minus E in the winter and then a reduction in spring. But during summertime, the agreement is less because, for example, when we look at the regional and the global simulation, one has projecting more precipitation over the southeast compared to the regional simulation. And then for fall, we also see large disagreement between the particular global model versus the CMIP5 model, suggesting that, for example, the way to represent the land surface processes could be important because we see agreement between the regional and global model because these two models actually use the same land surface model. So overall, we see a lot of agreement among the different simulations except for summertime and also for the fall season, which are driving some of the differences in the annual changes. Here, I just want to show that the particular CCSM member that we downscale, in fact, are very similar to all the other CCSM members. So quickly going to my conclusion, we see that dynamical downscaling preserves the large-scale patterns of the climate change signals, but they are adding more fine spatial scale features, particularly in the Western United States areas of complex terrain. Similar spatial patterns of change seems to persist over time. So over time, you have increasing amount of warming and increasing magnitude in terms of the changes in the precipitation. And there's also an increase from 4.5 over to 8.5, suggesting that perhaps some sort of spatial scaling is not a bad idea. And then we see changes in P minus E dominated by general increases in the wintertime and decreases in the spring season, perhaps driven a lot by changes in the temperature. But there are divergences in the scenarios during the summertime and fall, driven perhaps by changes in the convective precipitation as well as evapotranspiration that are more addressed by the land surface model that might differ among the different models. So lastly, these are the total 15 variables that we have archived at hourly resolution, 20-kilometer resolution or downscale to 1/8 degree resolution over the United States. So these are suitable for a lot of different types of analysis and modeling related to energy, hydrology, as well as crop.